Is everyone sufficiently snacked and refreshed? Should we start on time since this is a time management class? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Graham. For those of you I haven't met before, to give you a little bit of background and context as to why I'm particularly passionate about this topic. I have two businesses, the first of which is a distributorship called Right Sleeve here in Toronto. We've been around for 15 years. And 3 years ago, we spun out software that we had built in-house to originally run Right Sleeve to license as a CRM and order management platform for the promotional industry called commonsku. So with two businesses and 25 employees and 3 children under the age of 9, life's a little hectic. So time management is something that I need to be highly, highly conscious of and to make every day as absolutely productive as possible. So I spend a lot of time reading on the topic and researching it and constantly thinking about different ways of prioritizing and being able to help the teams run smoothly and what kind of tools and techniques we can be using to make sure that we are leveraging everything to the best of our abilities. So, how many of you feel like this a lot of the time in this business? We're in a always on, instant response expected, 24/7 industry right now. When you think about what it used to take to order a pen 20 years ago, it was a month-long process. You sent the camera-ready artwork off to the supplier, and you waited for the proof to come back, courier, and the proof to come back, and maybe the horse and buggy went around and did something else, and now it's 24 hours. And customers expect that, and they expect your ability to service them to be in line with that. You combine that with everything that's going on with technology, and everyone just feels overwhelmed and bombarded, and you've got email to manage and constantly competing priorities, and of course with the speed having increased, it increases the chance of problems, so you're fighting more fires, and all these things compound to create this, where you feel as if you're overwhelmed on a really regular basis. So, we're here to talk about what to do about this. We're going to talk about 3 different areas. So we're going to talk about the what, and this is the what should you be doing in your day. And I'm not here to tell you how to do your job specifically. I don't know exactly what's involved in your job, and all of your jobs are different, I'm sure. So we're going to talk more kind of philosophically about the what should be. Next, we're going to talk about the when. So once you've identified what you should be doing, let's talk about when are good times during the day, during the week, during the month to be tackling different initiatives. And then lastly is the how. So we're going to talk about a variety of different tips and techniques and tools and resources and things that you can use to understand how to complete the cycle as far as getting the what done. Sound good? How are we on sound? Everything good? Everyone can hear? Okay, let's dive in. So, Okay, so let's talk about the what. This is what every day looks like. You've got your own to-do list that you've come up with, that you're trying to approach your day with. You've got all these external demands that are constantly competing for your time, and then you've got everything in between that just comes up unexpectedly on a day-to-day basis. So some days you're juggling all these balls like a total rock star and everything looks amazing, and other days you look like this, where it just feels as if everything is going off the rails, you're dropping balls left, right, and center, and it can become very stressful. I don't know whether any of you have heard this story before, but there's a professor who gets up in front of his university class, and he has in front of him some rocks and some pebbles and some sand and a jar. He takes the jar and he puts the big rocks into the jar and he holds it up to the class and he says, "Is the jar full?" The jar looks full. The class says, "Yes, it's full." So he then proceeds to take all these pebbles and he puts them in, and they find their ways into the nooks and crannies in between the rocks, and they all fit into the jar, and he holds up the jar again to the group and he says, "Is the jar full?" "Yes, it is." You think they learned by now. The answer should be no. So he then takes the sand and puts all that in, and of course it finds its way into every single little nook and cranny and fills up the jar, and he holds it up and he says, "Is the jar full?" The class says, "Yes." And of course he then proceeds to pour water into the jar, and that fills in every other component in there. And usually this analogy is used to illustrate the fact that you can always fit more into your life or into your day. There's always room to kind of squeeze things in. But I want you to think about this from a different perspective. So that's what it looks like when you got all the different components in there. And if you think about this analogy from the perspective of the sand and the pebbles and the water are all the interruptions in your day. It's the emails, it's the voicemails, it's the last minute requests, it's the meetings, it's all the different things that fill up your day. And think about the rocks, the big rocks, as being the important strategic things that you need to get done in a day. If you don't plan for the rocks and make time for the rocks, this is what happens. The sand and the pebbles and the water fill up the jar first, and there's no room for the rocks. They start overflowing out the top. So think about that really simple visual as far as the important need to plan during your day. You've got to think about what are those big rocks. So each of you, just think for a second, what is your unique ability that you bring to your organization that can really move the ball forward in 2014? Think about your singular area of expertise, what it is that if you had all the time in the world that you should be focusing on the most that is going to have the biggest impact on your company. Just think about that for a sec. Whatever that is, that represents the rocks in your business, and you need to think about how to identify what those rocks are. How do you sit down and think about how to create the rocks of your own planning? So identifying what the things are that you need to make more time for. And that's when I talk about the what. That's a really important part of it, is understanding what you should be spending your time on that is really going to move your organization and your role forward. So, the key part of this is that once you've thought about what those rocks should be, if you don't actually plan around how it is to accommodate the rocks, you see what happens with the jar. Everything else takes its place and there's no room. And it is so easy, as I'm sure you all know, to spend your entire day managing your inbox, dealing with your voicemail, and you leave at the end of the day thinking, wow, I was so busy, I got so much done. But really, you just managed your inbox, and that wasn't necessarily kind of what should actually be strategic or important as far as your job is concerned. So the key aspect about this is actually creating a plan to be able to tackle those rocks. And a big component of this is thinking about how do you actually break it down? Because if you say, that one of your rocks is going to be that you're going to land a big prospect or whatever, your role happens to entail. And when you think about that, it seems really daunting. It seems really big. How am I ever going to make time for this? I've got so much going on. I've got all these competing demands. My days are so busy. So a lot of it has to do with breaking it down into things that seem a lot more manageable than a giant rock. One of the things that we do in my two organizations is identify one single thing that you are going to get done today that is not busy work, that is not kind of managing the day-to-day elements of your job. It's one single thing that represents a movement towards achieving one of your rocks. And if that remains on your to-do list or whatever it is that you use to organize yourself, it is making sure that come hell or high water, no matter what happens during that day, you accomplish the one single thing. And by keeping it really simple and concrete and tangible and kind of easy to accomplish, it becomes a lot easier to say, yes, I did that one single thing. No matter what else, if my day blew up, I still got that one single thing done today. As opposed to approaching the day with this massive to-do list of 15 different things that you're going to get accomplished, which is completely unrealistic with the realities of this industry and the constant interruption that happens. The component of this that is really, really important is breaking things down into small tasks. And I mean as granular and minute as possible, that as that example with looking to land that big prospect client as an example, that the first step of that could be, research that organization on LinkedIn. Or the first step could be, identify who you are going to call to get a referral. The next step then is call that referral to ask for it. So it's breaking it down into very, very tactical, granular things that make it far more easy to accomplish when you're trying to fit them into a busy day. It also means that it makes those big rocks seem way less intimidating, because all of a sudden you're not saying, I need 3 hours of time in order to accomplish that huge strategic thing. It's, I need 5 minutes to go onto LinkedIn, or I need 2 minutes to call that person to ask for the referral. And it also means if there are those of you that derive great satisfaction from ticking off the to-do list, it means you can check it off and feel good about the fact that you've gotten it done. The key aspect of this, when I talk about planning, is making sure that you're actually making time to do that planning, to identify what those tasks are, whether it's a one single thing that you're going to do or however many things that you identify you're going to get done in the day. It's making time to do that planning. And the key aspect of this is to either do it first thing in the morning, so as soon as you arrive, before you open your email, before you get going with your day, sit down and plan what is either the one single thing or 2 or 3, however many priorities you're going to try and tackle in a day. Identify that first thing in the morning when you get in, or last thing at the end of the day before you leave. Fit it in either way, and that way when you get going during your day, you've got that one single thing identified that you need to get done no matter what else happens. So that's an introduction into the what. Let's now talk about the when. So we started talking about the when in terms of, at a minimum, doing some planning at the beginning of the day or the end of the day. The key part is understanding kind of how your individual day flows and when you are going to get things accomplished within that. When you are identifying what those rocks are, or what the one single thing is that you're going to get done in the day, you've always got to balance out 3 different elements of it. First of all, how much time is it going to take to get that task finished? So maybe it might be a quick, 2-minute, do some research, make a phone call, something easy, or it might be something that takes a little bit longer. Maybe it's going to take half an hour or an hour, or possibly even longer than that. So the key thing is making sure you've identified how long that task is going to take so that you can plan it during your day. The other part of it is figuring out how much energy is that task going to take. If it's something super simple like making a phone call or doing a bit of research, it's probably not going to take a lot of energy, so it doesn't matter kind of when during the day you need to do it. Whereas if it's working on a budget spreadsheet or something that is going to require a lot more kind of mental processing, you might want to do that at the time of day that you're best. Maybe that's first thing in the morning, maybe it's right after lunch, maybe it's at the end of the day, maybe you're a night hawk and you do it at night. Identifying kind of when you're at your best, if you have something that is a high energy task, is a critical thing. And the last thing is identifying what is the priority of that task. So if you've got 3 different things that you're looking to get done during the day, how do you make sure you're identifying which one is the how you prioritize within those 3 things? So balancing out the amount of time it's going to take, the amount of energy it's going to take, and how much priority it takes is how you're going to ensure you're fitting those tasks in your day. The part about this in terms of planning the blocks of time is that if you do need something that's going to take 2 hours, make sure you're not putting that on a day when you see that you've got all these other things blocked up against each other and you've only got one window of time with tons of other meetings. You're never going to get it done if that's the case, because during those time blocks in between your meetings you're going to be dealing with email or putting out fires or whatever else happens. So if you have a task, a rock or whatever you want to call it, that's requiring a bigger chunk of time, allocate it to a day where you actually have a larger window where you've got a bit of buffer on either side. Maybe you see a day where you have an entire morning open and you say, I'm going to block 2 hours for that budget spreadsheet prep or whatever it is that is going to take a chunk of time and require a fair bit of energy. But pick a day where it makes sense in terms of what the rest of your day looks like, and then be disciplined about holding that time slot. Treat it as if it were a client meeting. You're not going to move a client meeting if something else comes along and bumps in the way, so treat it as if it's just as important as a client meeting. Because remember that if you're not making time for the rocks and what it is that is taking advantage of your unique ability within your organization, it's going to be awfully difficult to move things forward. There will always be things that come along and want to bump those priorities. I talk a lot about finding the time of day when you can achieve what's called flow. And flow is a term that can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around sometimes. It represents a feeling of when you can really get in the flow of doing something. You kind of get in the groove, your mind is really churning, is working on kind of what it is that you need to accomplish, and you kind of get that feeling as if like you're really focused and you're in the moment, you're really kind of moving the ball forward forward in terms of getting this particular item done. For me, this happens to be at between 5 and 7 in the morning. That is my period of zen. The kids are asleep, I can sit there with a cup of coffee, it's quiet, I have no interruptions, the phone's not ringing, there's no email, there's nothing bothering me during that time period, and I get more done during those 2 hours than I get done during the entire day because there are no interruptions. So I find flow happens to be during that time period, and I will use it for bigger strategic things that require bigger thinking, or I will use it for catching up on reading. So because of the fact of running a software business and a promotional company, I do a lot of reading on things to continue to go up the learning curve. So blog posts, articles, things that you can't really focus on during the day, or if I try to read it during the day, I find I get, one paragraph in and then something distracts or someone interrupts and then you've completely lost your context and you got to go back and reread it again. So things like that in the morning when it's quiet and I can focus on more cerebral activities, that's the time of day when I find that I get the best kind of flow. For some of you, it may be, a chunk of time in the afternoon, maybe it's in the evening, whatever. But think about that in terms of what works, what suits your specific personality in terms of the time of day when you can get into a groove and really dig deep into something. So, we talked about the how, we talked about the when, we talked about the what, we talked about the when, and now we're going to talk about the how. This is an aspect that you need to think about in terms of what your specific work style is. Everybody has different things, whether you're more of a paper person, whether you're more of a digital person, whatever it is that are the different kind of tools and techniques that you use are going to be specific to your own individual preferences. But ultimately, I'm going to give you kind of a variety of things to choose from that you could create your toolkit out of, so to speak. Has anyone heard of the touch it once principle? So the key part of this is that, and we'll use email as an example here, that if you touch it once, just touch it once and make a decision about what you're going to do with it. So if you open up an email, how many times have some of you done this? You open up an email, you take a look at it, and you say, oh, I don't have time for that right now, and you close it, you open up your next email, and that first email that you were looking at goes down further in your inbox. You come back to it later in the day, you open it again, oh, I still don't have time for that, and so you close it, and next thing you know, it's sunk to the bottom of your inbox, and you've opened it 5 times before you actually do something with it. I know you're all guilty, you've all done that before. The problem with that is that every single time you open that email, you are rereading what it is that it requires you to do. And if you think about multiplying that by all the different emails that you receive in a day, think about how much time you're wasting just rereading the same emails, trying to make a decision about what you're going to do about that. Amplify that. Hundreds of emails that you're doing this to daily on a repeat basis. So there's 2 different rules that come out of this. It's called the touch it once rule and the 2-minute rule. So you open the email. If it's going to take you less than 2 minutes to deal with it, do it then. So if that's as simple as I need to forward this information to somebody else, or I need to reply to a customer, or whatever it is that is required of you, if it takes less than 2 minutes, deal with it then and there. Don't close it and open it up later. Deal with it then. So touch it once, do whatever is required if it takes less than 2 minutes. If you know it's going to take more than 2 minutes, there's a different kind of decision tree that proceeds after that. The key thing that you need to decide upon is what is the next action that is required on that email. If it is something that is going to take you longer than 2 minutes, what is the next thing you need to do? So let's say a customer sends an email to you saying, I need tons of different ideas for this upcoming conference or whatever, and you know that it's going to take you probably 2 hours to sit down and research ideas and put together pricing and do whatever else is required to answer that client. The next action on that could be as simple as send emails to a couple favorite suppliers to get ideas. So by identifying that that is your next action on that email, put that next action on whatever it is that you use for a to-do list. That could be a written paper book, it could be a digital list, but put that thing that you have to do, so emailing suppliers for ideas, on your list, or do it right then and there. If you have time to send them off right, that's going to take you less than 2 minutes to email those suppliers, do it right then and there. So you've taken your next action on what your next action is on that specific email. And the point is that you're not going to close that and reopen it again 2 minutes later. You've already done what the next step is on that. The parts about this in terms of prioritizing kind of what it is that you're going to do as far as the results of the email is concerned. It's deciding about, once you identify what that next step is do you do it now or do you do it later? If you can do it now, do it and get it dealt with. If it needs to be later, then when? When are you going to schedule it for? So if that, emailing the request off to suppliers is going to take a little bit of research in terms of thinking about who you're going to send it to, then say I'm going to do that, later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, and schedule it, or whatever mechanism you use in terms of keeping on top of your to-dos. Put it in there as being the next step. I keep a folder that I call to read. Because I subscribe to a lot of blogs or newsletters or various things that, as I say, I'd never have time to read during the day, I put those into a folder called to read so that they're out of my inbox. I'm not continually seeing that sitting there waiting for me to do something with. And it sits in that folder until I have some time to actually focus on it and get in that period, whether it's that Zen time first thing in the morning, and do some reading then. It's all just waiting. Or maybe I'm sitting in the airport waiting for a flight or something where you've got a little bit of downtime and nothing else that's pressing at the moment, and you want to tackle some of that backlogged reading. I often actually do it sitting in the hockey rink. 3 kids that play hockey, a lot of time sitting in the rink. So that being able to have all that organized, sitting in one little folder, kind of waiting for me, I find particularly helpful. It also means that otherwise, if you're not finding a way to kind of prioritize it or put it aside, what often happens with things like blog posts or newsletters is that it'll sit in your inbox and sit in your inbox and sit in your inbox and go further and further down until you reach the point of forget it, I'm never going to read it, I just delete it. And ultimately that kind of defeats the purpose if you're subscribing to something because you feel it's valuable for you to read and it's going to be interesting information for your particular role. Then put it in a place where you can prioritize it and make time for it at a different date. Key part about any of this kind of stuff is making a decision on whatever it is that you're going to do, and as the whatever expression you would like to insert here, just friggin' do it is what that expression means. The key, one thing that's really challenging about, or I'd say one of the biggest obstacles that gets in the way with time management is procrastinating on a decision. It's looking at that email and saying, I don't know, I got to think about this, or I need more information, or whatever it is that is stopping you from making a decision on that. Just freaking do it. Just whatever it is, just do it and make a decision on it and move forward. The more you can get disciplined about making decisions and taking action on things, the less stuff piles up, and the more you can kind of move the ball forward, the more you're able to focus on those big strategic rocks that you should be spending your time on. There's a lot of research out there right now about the fact that multitasking is the worst thing ever to happen to us. And if you think about what technology has done in this regard, it has played a huge role as far as how it is people approach their work and how they tackle their days. So how many of you have sat on a conference call or just a phone call and been doing their email at the same time? And all of a sudden you hear someone say your name and ask you something on the call, and you realize you've heard nothing of what happened in the past few minutes because you've been knee-deep in your email. What the research is showing is that your brain is not actually physically capable of doing 2 things at the same time. So it may seem as if you're multitasking like a champ and doing these things at the same time, but in reality, what your brain is doing is switching back and forth from one to the other. And it might be microseconds, so you feel as if you're getting things both done at the same time, but it is switching back and forth, focusing one thing at a time, then back to the other. And what happens in that instance is that you're doing something called constantly switching contexts. So if you're switching contexts from listening to that conference call and hearing what somebody's saying to reading your email, your brain is constantly resetting every time you switch contexts. So you're actually losing a tremendous amount of productivity because your brain resets every single time. It's the same thing as that example I gave of when I start to try to read an article in the middle of the day and I get one paragraph in and I get distracted. When I go back to that article, I've got to reread the entire first paragraph because I've forgotten what it said. So you're switching contexts, you're losing time and productivity because of the fact that your brain is constantly resetting. Again, when you think about multiplying this over lots of different times when you're multitasking during the day, you're actually losing a huge amount of productivity because of when you think you're actually doing lots of different things at the same time. So, the big thing that's in vogue now is called single tasking. And what the studies are showing is that single tasking is actually hugely increasing productivity. So what single tasking means, as I'm sure you can guess, is focusing on one thing at a time. And by being able to dedicate the time, the mental energy, the mental resources to that one thing before you then move on to something else, you're actually getting far more done than trying to juggle multiple things at one time. There was a gentleman who came up with what he calls the Pomodoro Technique, which is exactly all about single tasking. And the reason why he calls it the Pomodoro Technique is because he took, those old school kitchen timers that you turn and they tick down the time. So he took one of these old kitchen timers that was actually shaped like a Pomodoro tomato. And so he calls it the Pomodoro Technique because of the fact that he was using this Pomodoro tomato to calculate time. So what he did was timed himself in increments of 20 minutes on single tasking things. So he would say, I'm going to do this one thing for 20 minutes and not get distracted by anything else, stay completely focused on one thing for 20 minutes. He would set his little tomato timer, and when that buzzer went, he could check his email, or he could switch tasks to something else, go for a walk, do whatever he wanted. And he ultimately he found this so effective in terms of how he was managing his time during the day that he actually started breaking down all of his tasks into what he called Pomodoros. So one Pomodoro was 20 minutes, and he'd look at a task and say, how many Pomodoros is it going to take to get that task done? So if it was 3 Pomodoros, he knew it would take an hour to get it done, so he would set his little timer and off he would go. But the reason why 20 minutes was chosen as the increment is it's actually part of what the research is also showing is that your brain can only sustain heavy focus for a certain period of time. And 20 minutes was kind of a magic window in terms of being able to really get something done in a deep, intense focus for one period of time. And 40 minutes was really the longest that you could possibly do. So 2 Pomodoros was the max that was going to be possible for anything in terms of really being able to heavily single task. So his philosophy was that he would do his increments, his 20-minute or 40-minute increments, and then take a break. So the big part of it was giving the brain a chance to reset, whether that was going for a walk, whether that was going and making tea, whether that was dealing with his email, whatever the case may be. It was giving the brain a chance to reset before tackling something else. This technique actually works really, really well if you think about email in this context. So if you say, I'm going to allocate, 1 Pomodoro to dealing with my email, focus only on going through your inbox for 20 minutes, applying the touch it once and the 2-minute principles and all that stuff to spend just 20 focused minutes on your email, then shut it down and go and do something else, whether that's the budget document, whether that's asking for the referral to the prospect, whatever it is that are your next kind of buckets. It's making sure that you don't spend your entire day flitting in and out of your email, because that element of switching contexts is part of what can wreck your productivity. You're constantly distracted by this, so that little indicator went off, and there's the bright shiny object going off in the corner of your computer. You get all excited about what that email says, or maybe there's something I have to deal with that's really urgent. But in reality, if you were out at a client meeting for that Pomodoro, that 2 Pomodoros, 3 Pomodoros for an hour, you would never check your email in the middle of that. So discipline your day the same way in terms of how it is that you single task on things. Singular focus just on that, then deal with your email or whatever else after that. So, some resources to look at. There is obviously a ton that is written on this topic. There are lots of experts. You could spend your entire life reading about time management and productivity and everything else and all the different philosophies around it. The person that's viewed as kind of being the guru in this space is someone by the name of David Allen. He wrote a very well-known book called Getting Things Done. And if you really want to feel like, one of the in crowd, it's called GTD for short. So you say, oh yeah, that's GTD. Then you'll sound as if, you're part of the cool kids that subscribe to his philosophy. So to give you some context, this book was written, I think maybe 15 years ago. So he refers a lot to paper-based organization. He talks about the Palm Pilot. So you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt from the perspective of how much things have changed as far as organizational techniques, physical tools that are now available with smartphones and everything else. So if you're going to read the book, adapt it to whatever your own kind of mechanisms are for organizing things now. But there's basically a technique that he walks through in this book in terms of how to get yourself organized in the first place, and then how to set up systems to keep yourself organized going forward. So the first step around this is what he calls collecting. And one of the big things that he talks about is what he calls open loops. So an example of an open loop is, good example, I was just sitting outside waiting for the session. I remembered that the tire pressure indicator is on in my car. In that context, I can't do anything about that, but I want to record the fact that I need to deal with it later, because I never remember apart from when I'm sitting in my car looking at the fact the tire pressure indicator is on. So having a place to be able to write down the fact that I need to deal with this. Or you're sitting in your office and you remember that you have to buy milk when you get home, or you're sitting at home and you remember that you have to call that specific client or deal with that estimate or whatever it is. It's always when it's out of context that you remember something. It's finding a way to collect all the things that are constantly swirling around in your mind of things that you need to do. What happens if you don't actually put these things down and capture them is it actually takes up a fair amount of kind of mental energy with these things constantly cycling through, and it actually creates anxiety because you're always wondering, you feel as if you've got so much to do and it's swirling and it's building, and every time you have something else that goes onto this list and it just kind of seems like it's escalating. Whereas if you've captured it and you've written them down, then at least there's that feeling of, okay, I've now at least started the process to begin to deal with it. So he actually has in the book a whole bunch of different lists of all the things that might be aspects that might be swirling around, in your mind. So he will walk through a bunch of different things that might spark kind of ideas for you for work, for home, for personal, and it could be as simple as that, you want to take a dream trip to Costa Rica at some point, and so at some point in time, you want to start researching that. Maybe that's 5 years away in terms of your plan around that, but if that's swirling in your mind in terms of thinking about that, just put it down. So some things could be long-term things, it could be things you have to do tomorrow, things you got to do next week, but ultimately it's capturing the fact that they have to get dealt with at some point. So that's the collection part of it. The second part of it is processing. So at that point is deciding how you're going to allocate the time to what it is that has to be done. And a big part of this is what we talked about earlier in terms of breaking things down into steps. So if we take that example of the trip to Costa Rica, what's the next step on that? Maybe the next step is actually putting a date in the calendar. I want to commit to that. I'm going to do that, 2 years from now, or that I'm going to start saving for that trip, or whatever is the next step that is required. Maybe I'm going to start researching it. What's the next action as far as moving the ball forward on that particular thing that you've captured? So once you identify what the next steps are on these different things, it's then organizing it. It's saying, I'm going to allocate that particular task to get done tomorrow, or I'm going to put that on my list of things to do in March. It's basically being able to prioritize what it is that you have chosen in terms of that huge long laundry list of stuff that might exist on there. So it's picking specific dates or times that you're going to get things done, and then it's constantly reviewing that list, because not everything that is on that list are you going to pull forward and assign a date to. If there are things that are longer term, or things that are dream things down the way, whether that's for work, whether that's for play, just continually review that list, be pulling forward what the next action is on the things to be able to allocate a time or a date to them in order to keep moving the list forward. And the last thing, obviously, is do it. Just freaking do it. There are, similarly in terms of the number of books and articles and everything else that have been written on this topic, there are tons of people who have tried to tackle this as far as techniques and tools are concerned. So there's been special calendars created, which I'm sure some of you have sold before in this business. There are all sorts of apps that have been created to try and manage kind of to-do lists and to help prioritize. So I'll only scratch the surface in terms of two particular apps that I find highly useful. Both of these are to-do apps. The first one is called To Do, and the second of which is called Remember the Milk. So both of these are apps that will live on your phone, but they are also browser-based apps. So you can have a browser window open on your computer that has the same mirror image of what's going on your phone. And the neat thing about there's two different things that are particular about each of these. With To Do, the idea is that you will allocate what is on your to-do list to specific days. It's like a calendar-based kind of app. If you don't get things done on that specific day, it will actually carry forward that task to the next day. So those of you that are paper-based, I'm sure you find you write out your to-do list, and the next day you turn the page and you realize that stuff you didn't get done the next day, you've got to move forward and rewrite it again on the next day. This does it for you. So it moves it forward onto the next day. Obviously, the challenge with that is that if you aren't knocking things off your list, next thing you know 3 days later, your list has grown this long, and now it defeats the purpose in terms of having allocated things to a specific day. Remember the Milk has got a neat feature that I particularly love about it. It's got a way to bucket different things. So I have a list for my personal stuff. So when I need to get the tire pressure indicator doubled on the car, or go and buy milk, I've got stuff for right sleeve, I have stuff for common SKU, I have stuff for projects or like long-term things. So it allows you to kind of segment what the different elements of your life and keep them separate, but also then kind of view a merge view when I want to know what are all the different things across all those different buckets that I said I have to get done today. I can see that view of today. Whereas if I'm wanting to plan and prioritize, I can say, okay, what are all the different things that I've got laid out for a common SKU for the next little while, so I can start picking out what my next actions are from those and allocating them to specific days. So I just find it a neat way to kind of keep organized, and there's a lot of different moving parts. And the fact that it's on your phone means when you're standing in the grocery aisle and remember you've got to email that client, you can capture that right then and there on your list, and as opposed to having it swirling around in your head and at risk of being forgotten. Has anyone heard of something called the inverse productivity curve? So this is a theory that first started being talked about a lot in the software world. And the reason why it was talked about in the software world is because there was a very strong correlation to the fact that code that developers pushed after midnight had a significantly higher number of bugs than code that was written earlier in the day. So basically, the quality of work that you are doing deteriorates as the day goes on. And I'm sure, if you're pushing through something and you feel like you're being fabulously productive at midnight when you've been going since 8 in the morning, odds are the amount of time that it's taking you to get something done at that time would be a fraction of the time if you were doing it earlier in the day when you're fresh. So just be conscious of that in terms of how it is that you allocate your day. And there's obviously no end of work that can be done. I'm sure all of us could work 24/7 if we felt the desire to do so. But ultimately, if you actually constrain your day to a particular time period and say, I must be productive during these specific hours, you're actually more likely to get more done than if you don't constrain things and you say, I'll just get it done later on in the evening, or stay up late to get to do it versus tackling it fresh first thing in the morning. So I find kids are remarkable at creating a constraint for you. Got to be at the door at 5:30, got to be up at 9. So just being able to kind of create some bounds in that way, I think actually makes you more productive because you're limited. The last piece of what I will say is that when we talked about the whole thing of the Pomodoro Technique and this idea of being able to reset the brain, something that's really, really important kind of in the whole concept around productivity is that you can't go hard all the time. You reach a point where you get burnt out, you lose energy, you lose interest, and there's risk at that either you're not doing as good a job as you could, or you become disengaged, or the quality of work is not as good, you're not excited about what you're doing anymore. And it's amazing when you take the time to actually just step away And whether that's as simple as going for a walk at lunch and getting some fresh air and oxygen, or going out for lunch with someone, or taking some time to have a tea in the afternoon, or whatever it is that is going to allow you to just step back and reset. It's amazing how that actually creates a huge amount of it creates room for creativity. Something that we do is we bring a yoga instructor in once a week. On Wednesdays at lunch, we move the boardroom table out, and whoever wants to participate goes and does yoga for an hour. And the clarity of mind that I feel after that, when I get back to my desk and start work for that afternoon, is unbelievable in comparison to any other day when you've just been running all day long. So being able to find ways to reset, take time for yourself, will hugely help your overall productivity and also your passion for what you do. It's amazing how just walking out in the woods or wherever, that's the kind of stuff that actually sparks the most interesting thoughts in terms of more strategic things, giving your brain room essentially to wander, to think. Exactly. That's it. I find there's always a lot of questions when I've done this session before, so I'd like to leave a fair bit of time at the end. Questions?
Do you mix your personal list with your business list and keep them separate?
That's what I find with Remember the Milk, because it's got the buckets that I'm able to allocate them into the buckets, but then see that viewed list in terms of what actually has to get done during the day. It's so difficult to actually separate personal and work that. Yeah, that being able to have a way that kind of manages both and acknowledges that you've got stuff to do on both sides of the fence. So.
So Remember the Milk, does it prioritize?
There's a bunch of, I use the free version, which has a very good functionality, but ultimately there is a paid offering which is pretty cheap as well, that has a whole bunch of other souped up things that you can do. Probably prioritizing and all those things would fall into that. You can create some basic priorities in the free version. But the key part of it that I find is sticking to limiting the number of tasks that you're assigning in a day, and that way the prioritization doesn't become as important because you've only got 1, 2, 3 things that you're looking to get done. And the neat thing about Remember the Milk when you're actually adding a task is that you can say, call the client next Friday, and it knows what the date is, or do this tomorrow, and it's a very kind of intuitive app in terms of how it understands like the terminology around dating. So it's super easy to enter tasks. Like you don't have to go through this whole date picker and calendar thing. It takes 2 seconds just to put a task in. That might be a paid feature. I don't know. The part that I love about it is I'm a Google Mail person, and it has something called a Google gadget, say that 3 times fast, that you can actually, it's like a little widget that will sit next to your inbox. So when I have my screen up, my mail's in the middle, calendar's over here, calendar widget's over here, and then Remember the Milk widget is right next to it. So I've always got right there what it is that I have allocated to get done today that is front and center when I'm tempted to go deal with whatever else is in my inbox first. I've also been working on a technique for the past few months. I don't know whether any of you have heard of Inbox Zero. Inbox Zero. So it's exactly what it is said, where the idea is that you maintain your inbox at nothing. Believe me, it is possible. It takes work to get there in the first place in terms of to deal with any backlog that you have. But it is amazing how, and Gmail has this hilarious feature where if you actually have dealt with everything and your inbox is empty, it says like, woohoo, you have nothing important to do. And when you see that once, you're like, I want to see that all the time. So that's a real incentive to want to, yeah, exactly, delete. But the key part of it, obviously, is applying a lot of these techniques, the touch it once, the 2-minute rule, the making a decision about what the next action is. So it's being able to translate what those things are that are coming out of your inbox and creating a to-do list around it, as opposed to having your inbox drive your day and leaving things as, marked as unread or whatever, things that you might do in terms of having your inbox be your list. It's what inevitably happens when your inbox is driving your day is that you do the urgent at the expense of the important, and your day becomes, your jar fills with the sand and the pebbles and the water instead of the rocks. Yeah. I say there's only one thing that you take away from the session. That is it. Like, remember that image in your mind when you are tempted to. Yeah.
I'm a paper guy, and I've always looked for a solution on my phone, because I have my phone everywhere I go.
Yeah.
Everyone does.
Yep.
So I'm looking forward to trying this soon.
And the one thing I would say is that it takes 30 days to instill a new habit. So you may find if you first try to move over to a digital solution or trying one of these techniques or whatever it is that you do, that you're like, it's not working for me, it doesn't fit into my particular work style. Give it 30 days of trying it and see at the end of that whether it's working, because it just takes time to get used to a new process or a new habit. And because those are two different apps that both accomplish the same thing, like give them both a whirl and see kind of which one suits your particular style.
And I think if you're used to carrying around
Yeah.
I think the bigger hurdle is for people who just try and keep it upstairs and trying, that's the bigger thing. Trying to. I know my wife, I love her to death, but lists on a regular basis, that's not a thing. So I always want to encourage her to
Open loops. Think about the open loops. Every time you got stuff swirling around in your brain, it's taking up room. Yeah. And the part that I find with paper lists, because I used to be a very paper-based person. I love my journal or my book that I would write stuff down in. And then it's inevitably that one time that your child is sick or you're sick or something's going on and you're at home and your book's at work. And all of a sudden, you don't know what's supposed to be on your to-do list that day. And so being able to have, one thing I forgot to speak to, there was a line that I had there that said mobile syncing. It's this idea of being able to make sure that you have everything in one place, accessible from anywhere, that it doesn't matter if you forget your book at the office or you forget it at home or God forbid it gets lost, that you've got everything kind of aggregated in one place. And there's so many great digital kind of tools and techniques now. Dropbox, Evernote, remember the milk, all the different kind of things that can support that really easily now. It's far easier to implement a solution like that now than it used to be. Other questions?
Well, I'm just a terrible procrastinator. I really am, and that's why time management is so tough for me. It's like, and I know you're supposed to just do it, but the things I don't want to do or I feel incapable of doing, try and delegate as much as possible, but ultimately, there's a lot of stuff I don't want to do.
Yeah, and that, a big part of that is really just unpacking it in terms of making it seem easier to get done. Because so much of why we procrastinate is because something seems daunting, or you seem like you don't have the skill set or to accomplish it, or you don't know the answers. And so it's unpacking, like, how do I get the answers, or how do I get help, or how do I kind of move that incremental thing forward so that you feel as if you're making progress on it, but you're not having to ultimately tackle the big beast in one slaying. But it's amazing how when you, there's a Harvard Business Review article called The Monkey on the Back. Has anyone heard of this? So basically it's the idea that as a manager, when you are delegating things to your team, you basically are taking monkeys kind of off your back and you're putting it on their back to deal with. And every time they come to you with a question or a concern or a clarification or something else, if you don't answer them on the spot, if you say, I need to get some more information, I need to think about that in terms of before I make a decision, as soon as you hesitate, that monkey comes back on your back. And the more people that you are managing, the more monkeys you end up with on your back if you're not being decisive at the time. And they give some great examples of, you're walking along in the hallway and you pass, one of your team members at the water cooler and they say, I can't put that budget together because I don't have good parameters around this particular decision. And you think, I want to think about that okay, let me think about that and I'll get it back to you. Well, that monkey just leapt on your back as you were walking down the hall. And you now go back to the office with that monkey on your back and you now have a to-do list. And they're now driving your to-do list because you didn't make a decision. Whereas if you just said, go with $5 a head or whatever the case may be and made a decision on the spot, that monkey stays off your back. So a lot of it has to do with just getting in the habit of being decisive. And there's risk that comes with that, right? I mean, sometimes you're going to get it wrong and sometimes you're going to get it right. But if you think about the amount of time that gets lost through procrastination, odds are that's going to balance out the times that you get it wrong.
Because you're gonna get more done in the end.
Exactly, exactly. And the thing is that it's also balancing out the risk of the decision. Like if you do happen to get it wrong, what are the implications of it? I mean, if it's something huge, then yeah, you want to allocate the time that it's going to take to make a decision on it. But often it's more just that you think, oh, I want, more time to think about this, or I need, some quiet, uninterrupted time to think about this. Schedule it. Schedule at 6 in the morning or whatever that time frame is, and actually commit to doing it. By the end of that time period, I need to make a decision about what's going to happen with this. And that's the hardest part, is just saying that it's imperfect information. You're always working with imperfect information. So how do you make a decision based on the best decision you can make with the knowledge you have at hand and the time frame that you're given?
It comes back to habit.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why we're talking about time and I don't have time and commitment and it's the circle. That's how procrastination was born.
Exactly. And email is the worst contributor to all of that. There's some interesting articles being written about it now saying that email is the worst thing for productivity that was ever invented.
Especially reply all.
That's exactly it.
You say okay and you reply to everybody that it's okay. Like I did not need to open that.
Yeah, exactly. And some of that actually comes down to kind of, institutional training. So if you train your team that I don't want to be copied on this, or I don't need to be copied on that. And some of that comes down to empowering decision making, so they don't feel as if they're covering their you-know-what by copying you on stuff, that you're empowering them to be able to make that decision for themselves and not have to keep you in the loop, that it's kind of training around that. Or you do not write an email back saying, thank you. No, that's just going to make me mad. I don't. So getting your team used to kind of what works for you and what you want to see and what you don't want to see, and understanding what's unnecessary in terms of the reply to all or the replying with thank you or whatever the case may be.
The last word syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
You learn who they are.
Yeah. Do any of you have anything that has worked for you well that you want to share with?
I use a look reminder all the time. That's
Mhm.
for my big things.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, but I'm an email junkie. I've got it open all the time, and it seems like, wow,
Yeah.
oh, it's terrible. I could totally not. I can't break that. So I'll try again.
I do find it really interesting when I first started implementing this inbox zero idea, is I did it in conjunction with the whole single tasking concept and saying I'm just going to allocate this particular time to dealing with email, and you sit down and you systematically go through every single one, and if you have your email set up in such a way that as soon as you have replied or done whatever with that first one, it just opens the next and it keeps kind of going through, so that you can't cherry pick which one, oh, that one looks interesting, or I want to read that one first, that it forces you to systematically go through all of them, deal with it in less than 2 minutes, or make a decision on what the next thing is and put it on your to-do list and archive it. And there's so many amazing search mechanisms now within email, or whether you put it in folders or just archive it, that it's very easy to find things now. So knowing that, okay, I'm going to deal with that particular thing tomorrow, I'm just going to pull up that email tomorrow and then deal with it, as opposed to it sitting unread in my inbox waiting for me to allocate time for it tomorrow. And so if you do have that systematic, I'm only spending 20 minutes on this, you have to make a decision as you go through. And if you can get through everything that's on there and say, okay, now it's done, and now I'm moving on to the next, I'm closing that window or closing the browser. I've turned off all notifications on I don't have that little indicator on my computer or anything else that tells me when I have new mail, so that it's out of sight, out of mind, and on to whatever the next thing is.
Two things I do try to do it in order as I command. I do try to do something with it right away. But the ones that I do not read, and I say I'll do it later, they never get read.
Exactly.
If I say I'm not going to read it, they go down to the bottom of the list, and maybe a month down the road.
Exactly. You open it 5 more times and then decide I'm still not going to deal with it.
That was a month ago. Do I really need to know now?
Yeah.
So it's gone.
Yeah. It's out of date at that point. Yeah, Neil.
I don't know if it's wrong or not, but I do try and decide on everything that comes in very quickly. But I find that because I'm copied on so much, if I was to actually take those emails and drop them into folders,
Yep.
I would spend 2 hours a day doing that. So I just leave it all in my inbox. I bring things that I want into a folder. So I don't know if I can actually pull that off, but maybe I should be. I just don't know where I would find the time to bring all those things in folders. You're sometimes dragging them down here and waiting for the screen to catch up to bring it into a folder.
Yeah. If you think about why it is that you're using folders, are you using it to be able to find that later, and can you find it later just by searching the name or the subject line? Or so forget about folders, throw them out.
Well, folders are good for really important information, I think. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I significantly condensed the number of folders that I was keeping for that exact reason. If you spend half your day filing stuff, and I was never using that, syntax again later to find something. I was just searching by the person's name or email.
Right.
Google has us well trained in that regard too. It's all about search.
The email, it creates a rule, right? When an email comes in,
Yep.
it will automatically define box.
Yes.
That box.
Yep. Yeah, so that if you're copied a lot on things that you don't really need to take action on, you can create rules around that. The problem I find is that if you have a rule that's kind of is too loose from the perspective of every time I receive an email where these two people are copied, if it goes into a folder but there's actually something that happens to be important on that email and it just gets put into that folder without you seeing it, I find that's challenging. So maybe the better thing is to say, why am I getting copied in that email in the first place if I'm not actually reading what's in there? The Google Mail has a neat option to where they have something called priority inbox, so you can actually train it to say what are the most important correspondences that you receive, who are the people that you correspond with the most, or whose emails you open right away, and it puts those in the upper section at the top saying that's called priority inbox, so you know that whatever is falling into that bucket typically requires your attention immediately, and then it's got a bucket that's below called everything else. So things like e-blasts or whatever else, or things that are notifications that from Facebook or whatever the case may be, like those kinds of things will fall into the everything else bucket. So it means that if you've got a bunch of spam in there as an example, it's easy to just go tick, 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 delete really quickly, kind of all in one row, and you know that everything that's truly urgent is sitting in your priority inbox above. Big fan of Google Mail.
Are you a big fan of Google?
Huge fan of it. Yeah.
I have this email account, but I don't use it for that. I use it for when I
For all your
the
personal.
bill.
Yeah, for the email dump where you don't want to get spammed. Yes.
1,000 emails a month.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but it just has a lot of amazing features in terms of the cloud capabilities that have made kind of having everything in one place a lot easier.
And your Gmail, is that like CatherineGraham@gmail.com?
No, it's domain specific. So we've got a right sleeve email, a common sleeve email. It's,
All Gmail.
yeah. Yeah. And so being able to have calendar sharing and through Google Drive, you can have document sharing where you can be working on the document at the same time. We have like an internal wiki that's all through Google Apps for sharing stuff like documents or whatever that you want to be able to maintain kind of as an organization. It's big fan. Plus things like cool Google gadgets. Any other questions? Well, it's the end of the day. I'm sure you're all tired, so we'll end there. All right.